Let's now bring the conversation back to my colleagues on the dais for questions, comments, and concerns. I know my colleague just stepped out and she has some comments. Assembly member, maybe I could just kick it off and ask about the Medical Board of California, and I thought I heard support if amended. There were some concerns expressed in the analysis about having to prove violations and the intent of the licensee. Have those issues been resolved?
I understand that we're still working with the medical board to help address any of the outstanding concerns. But as it's the bill is before you currently, those issues are still outstanding.
Do you? I mean, given the fact that this is heading to appropriations next, how close are you to resolving those issues? I mean, it occurs to me that that could be a significant problem in terms of proof. Having to prove one's intent can be somewhat problematic, regardless of the setting, including this one. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. Yes. I mean, as specifically stated, the board specifically hopes to address to get that of the records, but I understand just as legislative history that the bill did not pass in this House, in the Senate, but certainly have good faith negotiations in trying to iron out any outstanding issues.
Okay. Well, I believe my colleague Senator Melendez has some questions, so let's let the Vice Chair take it.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there were a lot of concerns raised here today. And there are clearly a lot of people who support and also a lot of people who are in opposition to this. It is always disappointing, though, when legislators dismiss the opinions of those who are in opposition. I'm not suggesting that you have done that. I'm suggesting that we have had some members who don't seem to take seriously those who are in opposition, and that is always disappointing. Everyone is entitled to their point of view. My questions for you are relating to the definition of misinformation. I know that the medical board had some concerns about that, and I see you've made some changes to the bill and you've tried to narrow that, but I don't know that it even defines misinformation yet. I think it clarifies that it's grossly negligent, but what exactly is it? Can you give me an example?
Sure, and if I might just the chair answer specifically with respect to the committee analysis as well, and then perhaps Dr. Sawyer might be able to express additional observations through the chair, if that's acceptable to you, Senator. But as outlined on page 2, specifically the definition of disinformation means the misinformation that a licensee deliberately disseminated with malicious intent specifically, or an intent to mislead. And then secondly, Senator, dissemination means the conveyance of information from a licensee to a patient under the licensee's care. So my understanding with respect to addressing and narrowing it in the scope is outlined clearly and as solidly defined.
So how do you then prove that somebody did so with malicious intent? How would one do that? Because I'm looking at the medical board, which is comprised of half of them are doctors and half of them are attorneys. And attorneys are no more qualified than I am to, decide what is medically accurate and what is not. So how do you decide the intent?
Sure. Maybe Dr. Sawyer, you can help address that specific issue as you've been working with the board specifically.
Yep, happy to. So first I want to say malicious intent is reckless disregard for the truth or intentionally misleading others.
Okay, so let me ask you this before you continue.
Sure.
So over the course of time in this pandemic, things have changed, right? We know things now we certainly didn't know in the beginning. New treatments have come out. So I'm envisioning a situation where we have we have treatments today, but then 2 months from now, there's something that we've discovered, you know what, this actually works. This is actually a proven method to help ease symptoms, but as a physician, you've already been reprimanded and punished perhaps because you gave your patients information that by yesterday's standards were deemed to be malicious and just, not good medical science.
Yes, Senator. So I would hope that would never happen either.
Okay. Well, hope's not a strategy.
Okay, so
when we're talking about people's careers.
So that is so let me be more clear. The problem that we're dealing with right now is patients who are being told that the vaccines have nanoparticles in them that are intended to track, trace, and control their mind, that it causes AIDS, that it is killing more people than COVID. And so that is the information that I would expect the medical board to hear and take seriously, specifically given the fact that they have up to 8 members that are physicians on the board who can tell the difference between academic debate and things that are just patently and verifiably false. That's the danger here. And the reason why it's so dangerous is because people believe it. After one of the doctors said that the vaccines magnetize people, I was working in the children's emergency department and a mom asked me, do vaccines really magnetize people? And I have over and over again is just, I don't blame the patients because they're misinformed. And I just try and reassure them and tell them as much as I know to help them get to the point where they're willing to get vaccinated.
Okay, and I appreciate that. However, I still go back to the fact that we have a board that is half attorneys, no offense, Mr. Chairman, and half physicians, whose idea of what is malicious might be different than what yours might be, and somebody's career is on the line here. Certain instances where it seems pretty obvious, but in other instances it may not be that obvious, and I have great concern about that. And
may I pose a question?
Sure.
There was a patient in South Carolina who called the medical board and told them that his doctor told him not to get a booster because it would kill him. And he filed a complaint with the medical board. We know that that's not true. And the medical board just kind of brushed it aside. And he ended up calling the reporter. This guy had no idea what to do. And he said, I think that if this is true, if the vaccines are killing people, then the medical boards need to take a stance.
Okay, but in your specific example, if you're saying that this happened and the medical board did nothing,
yes,
this bill isn't going to change that. The medical board will still do nothing.
So the medical board has asked for legislative authority because they don't feel that they have it to discipline doctors who are spreading misinformation and disinformation.
You lost me when you said the medical board wants legislative authority. I have the legislative authority.
Right, they're asking
members of
you.
this committee have the legislative authority.
Okay, I apologize.
The medical board does not, and I will under no circumstance cede our authority to the medical board.
That is not what I intended to say, and
Senator
I apologize.
Pan, I can't hear him when you're speaking off to the side.
That's not what I intended. They're asking you to amend the Medical Practice Act. That's not what I intended.
All right, that's fine. Thank you
I misspoke.
for clarifying. Okay, thank you, Doctor. I appreciate you trying to help me understand this here. So, Assemblyman, again, I think the definition isn't quite clear, and I still hold my reservations about who is the ultimate arbiter of what is malicious and what is not. That's where we seem to have a problem. Now, the medical board can already impose disciplinary action, correct?
Correct.
Absent this
Yes.
bill, right? Okay. So then your bill is seeking to allow the medical board to impose even stricter penalties. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
It's to clarify, Senator, and as I'm trying to best understand the specifics of helping to further define, if you have some suggestions to which you would be in support, very much happy to entertain such accommodations, as I know you're equally committed to the protection of all Californians.
Okay, well, thank you for that, but let's go back to what your bill is intending to do, because the medical board can already discipline physicians, right? So your bill looks to impose even harsher penalties?
It's to help clarify, Senator, as clearly defined on the misinformation that is being exacerbated in this climate. And so if the questioning with respect to helping to understand the legislative authority versus the authority that has been vested in the medical board by us in the legislature and the governor, happy to entertain some specific language that you might propose here in this committee to getting your support to help protect all of Californians.
Okay, well, Assembly Member, I don't know that you have provided any more clarity for me, but I do thank you for trying. I still have the same concerns. This bill goes to the Appropriations Committee next, so there's certainly not a lot of opportunity to make any changes. I don't anticipate any will be made in this committee, but I will say that physicians have a great responsibility to their patients. I think we all recognize that. And we certainly don't want physicians or medical personnel out there saying things to people that could do them harm. Although I suspect that that's already taking place today, having nothing to do with COVID, right? Because physicians get disciplined all the time, don't they? Sure they do. So the board already has the opportunity to discipline physicians who are operating outside of their boundaries now. This one concerns me because it seems to be this, COVID cudgel that is attempting to be used to intimidate physicians from sharing information that may very well be valuable to their patients. And again, I go back to, there were some things we didn't know in the beginning. There were certainly treatments that didn't exist in the beginning that now are in existence and are widely used, but perhaps prior to their introduction, people might think, well, that's crazy, that could never work, or had their hesitations about its efficacy. So that's my concern. I appreciate your desire to protect the patient. I really do. But I will not be able to support the bill in its current form today. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
Thank you. Senator Pan.
Thanks very much. And Senator Lowe, appreciate you bringing this forward. A few questions. So first of all, there's some questions about disinformation and COVID and so forth. And maybe you can help me here. So from what I understand, this is simply not something that you or I or individuals said this is a problem. We've had the World Health Organization declared that we had in addition to a pandemic, we had a infodemic. The U.S. Surgeon General put out a whole report on misinformation, disinformation as a public health crisis. The Federation of State Medical Boards, the sort of umbrella organization that brings together all the medical boards across the United States, has said physicians had a particular duty to patients and that should be held responsible if they spread misinformation. So can you perhaps speak to the nature of this crisis, that this is not something that you yourself came up with, or maybe just a handful of us, but this was actually there was a national call, an international call, but also a national call to action to address this. Can you speak to the rationale for bringing this bill forward?
Yeah, Dr. Pan, thank you. Specifically, number of members of the legislature, we are attempting to be as responsive as possible for the protection of all of Californians, as outlined here. And just to be that much more direct and frank, I'm actually surprised that there is opposition to what we know that this is a very straightforward piece of legislation to help empower the medical board to do its job. It's not oftentimes also, Dr. Pan, that you would see the California Medical Association in support of a legislative proposal that could further empower the board to reprimand its own members, but in doing so, helping to ensure the integrity and the standards of care and protecting all of Californians.
No, thank you, and I appreciate that. And actually, not only the California Medical Association, but Medical Association after Medical Association testified in support of this bill. So in other words, the doctors of California are saying the medical board needs to have this authority because we have a problem where, unfortunately, a small minority, but unfortunately, that minority is endangering the patients of California. and calling on the medical board and calling on us as legislators to give the medical board that authority. I also make note that there's in some of the previous discussion about the medical board, just to make note that it is the mission of the Medical Board of California to protect health consumers through proper licensing and regulation of physicians and surgeons. And certainly as a licensee myself, I know that a license is a privilege. It's something that the state grants that allows me to do certain things as a medical practitioner that ordinary people off the street would not be allowed to do, and that I'm expected to wield that license responsibly, and that includes conveying accurate information and the standard of care to patients. In fact, I believe, and I certainly appreciate the chair raising the issue with, but I mean, I think there is about, we need to be sure that physicians are practicing the standard of care. And in fact, when we talk about the medical board actually sanctioning physicians, whether it's with probation or loss of license, well, ultimately, yes, the medical board itself votes, and we can talk about how many physicians and so forth on the medical board. In fact, some of the consumer advocates think there's too many physicians on the medical board. That actually, there is an investigative process that involves actually getting an expert to review the documents to be sure to say, is the physician practicing the standard of care, or are they, potentially causing harm by through negligence, or unfortunately, if you say disinformation, even intentionally causing harm. Is that your understanding? I know you used to be chair of the Business Professions Committee and the Assembly, so you have some expertise in this area. That's not just simply a vote of the medical board. There's actually an investigatory process that takes place before sanctioning a physician.
Yes, that's correct. In every investigation, there's a medical expert that reviews the action specifically to best determine what has transpired. So there is a due process to collect as much information to assess the violation.
Correct. Thank you. And I think just to again acknowledge what you pointed out, and certainly I as a member of some medical associations, we usually are on the end fighting to not so much limit the medical board's authority, but being sure that we're treated fairly. So the fact that so many medical associations, in fact, I haven't heard a significant medical association actually in opposition to this bill, right? There may be some groups of doctors, but it's not, the medical associations are here before us advocating for the medical community, advocating for patients on not only this issue, but so many other issues, are here to say that they want to support this bill. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So, I think again, I think one of the challenges for the medical board, of course, is that being sure that they can carry out its mission. That mission's defined by the parameters we give it as in the code, correct? And I think it's important because we've had too many people die of COVID. We also, and unfortunately, and it was mentioned that, well, maybe there's a treatment that come up, but I haven't, I don't see any physician being punished for bringing up a treatment where there's actually there's actually good scientific evidence to show that it's either works or even potentially could work. I think the issue is that there are actually some, I don't want to call them treatments anymore, but things that people are still selling and actually personally profiting from, that actually we know the evidence that actually come in that doesn't work or could be potentially harmful as well. So, these are the extreme circumstances in which the medical board, in order to fulfill its mission to protect the public, that's why we have licensing, needs to have the authority to be able to examine whether someone who's been entrusted with a license should still retain that license and that position of trust with the state of California. And I appreciate that, my colleagues in the medical community certainly understand that, and that's why I see them here testifying and expressing their support for this bill. So certainly I'll be supporting your bill today, and I'll be moving the bill at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Senator Chobog.
Hello, Assemblyman Merlot. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for bringing this measure forward. Let me just begin by stating that I truly appreciate the intent of the bill of protecting patients and Californians as a whole. So let me just begin with that, because I do truly respect that intent. However, I do have reservations, and I'll explain why, especially when it comes to the realm of science and dealing with a new virus in this case, per se. And in the sense of, especially when it comes to science, I remember in 2019 and actually 20, started in 20, in 2020 and 21, there would be certain things that we knew that were stated. This is what we know, these are the facts, and, we would hear it in the news, statements made by doctors and reporters repeating it, and then a couple of months later, or even a year later, we'd hear something completely different when it came to what we knew or facts at that time. There's a sense in science that we understand that it's always evolving, and something that we have to consider, especially when you're dealing with something brand spanking new. There's going to be ongoing research, ongoing discussions and commentaries that are going to prove true today, but may or may not prove so in the future. And I understand the intent of trying to protect patients or Californians from people making statements that may not be truth, but I think the concerns that I have are in principle with regards to, well, what exactly is truth? Well, we know that science is always evolving and research is continuously ongoing, especially with something completely new such as COVID-19. So that in itself makes me a little nervous with regards to providing the space for doctors and scientists to do continuous research in this space and prove something that may be working, maybe in the experimental space of research, trying new medications and new things that are going to take time in order for them to be, approved by the FDA or by the medical boards as something that's true. So in the process or in the time of that, there are people who are willing to try new things and are willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to try that even though it's not FDA approved, or, I heard that this may be a possibility to address or to cure some, COVID-19 symptoms. That ongoing research right now, to penalize someone for sort of doing experiments or doing research makes me a little nervous, especially in science. In public safety, we had a bill, and I was trying to find what the bill was, and so I apologize, I don't have it in there. But we had a bill that stated that expert witnesses in science, would be considered, if anything were to question, to consider it as reconsideration for sentencing and I think it was sentencing and something else. I don't remember what it was. I wish I could know, but the bottom line or the underlying theme on that was the fact that science was ongoing and things could change. And so with that in mind, to narrow this bill and to pass a bill such as this and narrow the scope of what can be said and cannot be said makes me a little bit nervous, besides the First Amendment. I think more in the fact that because it is science, and I would hope that any patient or any Californian would have a trusting relationship with their medical doctor, facilitator, and know what their training was in order to assess whether or not something would work for them or take something as truth. And if you do question what your doctor may or may not say with regards to this space, that they always have an option to go and have a second, third, fourth, or even more opinions on that end. So taking in consideration, what the medical board and what the FDA or the public health agencies state as facts and compare that with what is being said. So on that notion, I'm hesitant to be able to support this bill at this time, but I do, and just in the sense of knowing that science is ongoing and research should be ongoing, and no doctor, no scientist should feel constricted by, exploring or doing research or making statements. And I'm hoping that consumers and patients will have the knowledge or the intuitive intuitive direction to seek different opinions. So on those reasons, I can't support the bill today, but I appreciate the intent of wanting to protect our patients and Californians as a whole. Thank you.
Colleagues, any other questions? Assemblymember, if this were a vaccine mandate, I'm generally not supportive of those except in very limited circumstances. But in looking at this bill, it seems to me that in order to have something that's actionable, in order to be able to take action against a doctor, the information that the physician is disseminated using this language has to be contradicted. So it's opposite contemporary scientific consensus. Contemporary scientific consensus. In other words, contemporary scientific agreement. Is there agreement with respect to COVID-19 vaccines?
With respect to the medical community?
Yes. Well, the scientific consensus. So
Right.
I guess it would extend beyond necessarily the physician community. It would extend to the pharmaceutical community. It would extend to the public health community. It would extend broadly, right?
Sure. And Mr. Chair, if I might, I am not a doctor. I know that there are doctors on this committee who can speak to it specifically, but in addressing and acknowledging the comments that you've made as well as the previous senator, we're very specific in this bill with respect to this definition of dissemination of information with malicious intent. So the outline that you provided, Senator, does not qualify because it would specifically outline here with malicious intent and intent to mislead specifically. So in this case of the doctor wishing to focus on helping to acknowledge and address specifically to help a patient, that's not listed in the bill specifically. And with respect to misinformation, that of disinformation and dissemination of misinformation would constitute that of gross negligence. So again, attempting to be as specific as possible and addressing that of specific harm. And that is what we are helping to address and empower the medical board to address.
Well, and my point was that I tried to make was it seems to be a pretty high standard. In other words, you have to prove that the information being disseminated is contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus, agreement in the scientific community, right?
Yes, overwhelming consensus.
Okay, any other questions? Well, let's go with Senator Bates first, and then I'll go back around.
Thank you, Assemblymember Lowe, and for our long discussion, very important. I'm having real difficulty with it because I see a patient getting information from their doctor that maybe, let's take the example of the individual who reported that their doctor said if you take the vaccine you'll die. We don't know the underlying conditions that might have been there that gave the physician that responsibility to let his patient know. Perhaps he was in cancer treatment a couple of years ago. I happen to have a friend who had that same sort of problem. So it seems to be something where you really need to make a distinction between hearsay, and I consider that from the patient-doctor relationship, a patient sending in a complaint, compared to a doctor who's actually publishing misinformation that is very dangerous and damaging, like you're going to get a chip in your brain. That's quite a different thing than a patient doctor relationship when in the privacy of that, the doctor says, I don't think you should do this, I don't think you should take this, and all the reasons why. So because of that, and considering the depth that we'd have to go into in discussing how the medical board might weigh in on something that's that complicated, I'm going to not be able to support it today. I understand the motivation, the passion on a part of our physicians. I also understand the concern of the opposition, because this is a reach into free speech, no question. It is a constitutional cloudy area for me, because once you start with COVID, what's the next thing? And we have to always think of the camel's nose under the tent and all that, because that's how things like this start, when we start to restrict the ability of a professional relationship to be talking to their patient, especially in the world, I believe, and in the arena of health and privacy. We have a nation on fire about that right now. So I'm going to not be able to support it today, but I want you to know I understand and I feel the concern that you have based on, friends I've had who've had what I didn't consider the best information. But we do know that people are getting COVID that are vaccinated and boosted 3 times. So there are areas there that are very, very gray and really need a little more depth of I think, specificity before you can bring something like this to the medical board and affect someone's career. So with that, I won't be able to support it today.
Thank you, Senator Bates. Just a comment, and then I'll go back around the room here. It seems to me that in the direct patient-doctor conversation, if a doctor says, you shouldn't take the vaccine, it may kill you, evaluation of patient condition, other factors, in order for that to be actionable, it's, as I read your bill, against the individual physician, the contemporary medical or scientific community must be in agreement that that comment, that the vaccine will kill you, is false. And so to the extent that you're considering the condition of the patient, and you have to, in order to evaluate that, I suspect that the medical board would have a very, very difficult time finding contemporary agreement among physicians in the scientific community. More general statements that are not related to patients, I think, may be a little more difficult. Senator Pan, still have a comment? Question?
Maybe since the research came up, let me just ask a quick question. There's many research organizations nationally, American Association of Science, in California, the University of California, et cetera. Any of those opposed to this bill are expressing concerns?
No.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Senator Archuleta.
Assembly member, we're talking about disseminating publicly, shouting out publicly, newspapers, whatever, voicing in such a way, versus the one-on-one patient-doctor relationship, where all of us look to our own physicians one-on-one, privately. But I think this is about disseminating publicly information that is misleading or interpreted as misleading. And I think that's the issue that, so are we trying to stymie the doctor from publicly saying something and punishing him or her because he did say something without data? Or is that up to the board to decide you made this statement without enough data? I mean, at what point does it make sense for that individual to be right or to be wrong?
Let's see, 3 bills, 630.
Would you elaborate?
Certainly, Senator. I'll mention it again for the third time on page 2, as it relates to the specific nature of the dissemination of information to cause harm to a patient that is intentionally misleading to an individual. So the specific language is very tight in the definition of disinformation, specifically then disseminated with malicious intent or an intent to mislead. And number 2, the dissemination is defined as the conveyance of information from a licensee to a patient in the form of treatment or device, but would constitute gross negligence if contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus. So very narrow in that scope.
Colleagues, anything else? Seeing
Just one last-
Senator Chobog, please.
Sorry, I know we all want to finish really quick, but I just want to make sure. So, if I can, you said within the scope of truth, right? Within the, with malicious intent, how does that relate to that the board, according to this bill, they'll be acting within the scope of truth, and anyone that goes against that truth will be acting in malicious intent? Where do the doctors experimenting or doing research in other areas that have not been accepted within that scope of truth or accepted truth by that board fit in?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understood the question.
So you're in your bill, you said you have very specific language that only addresses doctors who disseminate information with malicious intent. That malicious intent, in your definition, is within anything that goes against the scope of truth or what is considered scientific truth, accepted as scientific truth. Where do doctors or researchers, or more, I would say more doctors because it's specific to doctors, that are doing research and research and experiments outside of that accepted scientific truth fall when making statements? I think what I'm trying to say is, would you consider anybody that is not within that scope of truth or scientific truth be considered or labeled as malicious intent?
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but specifically, as we've stated, the licensing holders come with certain obligations that is subscribed to that of the medical board by the legislature. And so if the question is, are there individuals to continue to have free thinking and explore other methods? Certainly, but what we're talking about here is within the scope and what is defined that of the standards of care that comes with that of the license itself.
And the standards of care I have no problem with. It's whether or not they believe that they have other means of treating something or making statements that have not been accepted as scientific truth, but are in the process of doing that research. But within this bill, within the scope of this bill, they would be considered, or actually my question would be, I shouldn't be stating what your intent is, but would they be considered under this malicious intent by disseminating what they're doing in research and expressing what they're doing or what they've seen before it's considered scientific truth by the board?
No, there's unless there is harm specifically, and as a member of this committee and sitting on a number of sunsets, as you know, the history of healthcare, when we're talking about some of the other medicines and practices, whether it be acupuncture or chiropractic, as we continually evolve in thinking about how we have a full adoption of other medical procedures and practices, that is part of the conversation that we're having here specifically. But again, the gross negligence and the misleading with the intent is where we're very narrow in that scope to actually harm a patient.
Colleagues, anything else? Is there a motion on this bill? You did? I missed it, Dr. Pan, but I have you now. Senator Pan has made the motion. Assemblymember, if you're not too exhausted, would you like to close?
Senators, this is really straightforward. Very straightforward. That a medical professional who is licensed in the state of California shall be reprimanded if they spread information with the intent to mislead. Very specific. And as I understand that some of the other senators on this committee are also former licensees themselves, that also comes with specific obligations. That is what's provided in which you obtain a license. And so that's what we are doing here today, to helping protect all of Californians and allowing a due process to occur and protecting everyone from what is the truth. And I respectfully ask for a vote.